The saloon was quiet that evening, its lanterns flickering low, casting shadows that stretched like secrets across the wooden walls. She stood there, her eyes sharp, her lips trembling between anger and disbelief, while he, the cowboy, held his ground with the calmness of a man who had weathered storms fiercer than bullets. His voice was steady, carrying no hesitation when he said, "I don't want you for your beauty, but for who you are." The words cut through the silence like the crack of a whip. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to still, waiting for her reply. And then, with bitterness edged in fear, she called him a liar. In the Old West, where lives were traded for gold and women were too often judged by what they could offer rather than who they were, his words were more than a confession. They were rebellion. Yet, for her, it was easier to believe in deception than in sincerity. Too many promises had turned to dust. Too many oaths had been broken under the endless sky. She had learned to guard her heart as fiercely as any man guarded his land. And now, standing face to face with him, she wondered if his declaration was another weapon meant to disarm her. The cowboy did not flinch at her accusation. He had not spoken to flatter, nor to charm. His gaze remained steady, revealing a truth carved deeper than the scars he carried across his hands. He knew the land was merciless. He knew the world was quick to strip away dignity. And yet, he had chosen to see her differently, not as a shadow of beauty to be admired and forgotten, but as a soul whose strength and resilience burned brighter than any star above the prairie. Her chest tightened, torn between disbelief and the faint hope that his words were real. Hope was dangerous in the West. It could keep a woman alive, but it could just as easily destroy her. She wanted to turn away, to shield herself from the ache of wanting to be believed. Yet the way he spoke, the calm defiance in his voice, made it harder to dismiss him. He was not asking for her trust. He was offering his own. And in that moment, the story began. Not with a promise wrapped in sweetness, but with a challenge. A man daring to prove that beyond dust, beyond blood, beyond the shallow judgments of a cruel land, there could exist something true. And a woman torn between rejecting what she feared and embracing what she had longed for. The West would decide the outcome, as it always did, but that night marked the beginning of a tale where the heart had to fight harder than any gun ever could. The words hung between them like smoke after a gunshot, sharp and lingering. She had called him a liar, her voice trembling not from anger alone, but from the deep scars of mistrust carved into her by the West. Too many men had spoken with sweet tongues only to leave her shattered, used, or forgotten. In her world, beauty had always been a currency, one she had never wished to trade, but one others had forced upon her. To hear him speak of her worth beyond, that was almost unbearable. She had heard promises before, and each one had turned to ash. The cowboy did not move closer, nor did he retreat. He stood firm, his hat casting shadows over eyes that told stories his words could never capture. He was not a young man full of empty bravado. His face carried the marks of wind, sun, and loss. His voice had not wavered when he said those words, and even now, under the weight of her accusation, he did not flinch. He had not come to win her with charm. He had come to speak a truth that cost him nothing less than vulnerability. Around them, the saloon buzzed faintly, but no one dared interrupt. Men played cards in silence. Women carried trays without lifting their eyes, and the barkeep pretended to clean a glass while his ears caught every word. It was not just their moment anymore. It had become a tale in the making, one that would be whispered long after lanterns burned out. The Old West thrived on stories, and this one had already begun to write itself into the wood of the room. She turned her face away, but even in her defiance, her heart beat faster. She wanted to dismiss him, to laugh at his words, to bury the dangerous seed of hope he had planted. Yet there was a weight in his tone that could not be ignored. This was not a man trying to conquer her. This was a man daring to see her when she had spent years hiding behind walls of mistrust. That frightened her more than any bandit's threat. The cowboy finally broke the silence with words simple yet unyielding. "You can call me a liar," he said, "but I'll prove myself in the days to come. Not with gifts, not with pretty words, with how I stand when life tests us." His voice was quiet, but it struck with the force of a hammer. And in her heart, though she tried to smother it, A flicker of curiosity began to burn. The following days carried an unspoken tension, a thread binding them together, even as she tried to pull away. She kept her distance, speaking little, her gaze sharp and guarded. Yet every time she looked at him, she caught glimpses of a truth that unsettled her. He worked with a steadiness rare among men of the frontier, his hands blistered by rope and plow, his back bent under the weight of honest labor. There was no vanity in him, no hunger for admiration. His strength lay not in words but in deeds. One afternoon, when a storm broke across the plains, she found herself stranded near the barn, rain soaking her clothes, mud clutching her boots. She expected him to smirk, to mock her struggle, as others had done before. But instead, he wordlessly placed his coat over her shoulders, his own skin left to the bite of the storm. He asked for nothing in return, offered no sly remark. He simply walked beside her through the mud until they reached the farmhouse. For the first time, she wondered if he truly meant what he had said. At night, she lay awake, the sound of the rain on the roof echoing the conflict within her. Was it possible that his words had been honest? Could a man look at her and see more than a face, more than a body, more than the beauty that had brought her both attention and sorrow? Hope was dangerous, yet she could not silence it. She remembered the fire in his eyes when he had spoken, and she could not forget the way he carried himself, not as someone demanding, but as someone offering. The cowboy, for his part, did not press her. He continued his days with the same rhythm as before, tending to the cattle, mending fences, greeting her with quiet nods rather than attempts at persuasion. His restraint was its own proof, a silent declaration that he valued her presence more than her acceptance. He did not need her to believe his words instantly. He only needed time to let them root in truth. And so, a fragile balance began to form between them. She remained cautious, her heart locked away, yet she found herself watching him more closely than she admitted. His actions spoke with the clarity that words never could. The West was a land where promises were easily broken, but his silence, his patience, and his steady presence whispered louder than any oath. Against her will, she began to wonder if perhaps he was not a liar after all. The prairie had a way of testing every word spoken beneath its vast sky. Weeks passed, and with them came trials neither of them had chosen, but both were forced to endure. One evening, a stray calf wandered far from the herd, and she, determined to prove her worth, set out to bring it back. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the grass, and the cries of coyotes soon filled the air. Her heart pounded as fear clawed at her, but she pressed on, unwilling to return empty-handed. When the coyotes circled closer, snarling in the dusk, she felt the weight of her own fragility. But before the terror could consume her, the thunder of hooves cut through the night. The cowboy rode hard, his rifle steady, scattering the predators with a crack of gunfire. He dismounted without a word, his jaw set in the way of a man both relieved and angry. She expected scolding, perhaps even mockery, but instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Bravery doesn't mean going alone. It means knowing when to let someone stand with you." Those words sank deeper than the fear had. For so long, she had fought to prove herself, to show the world she was more than a face, more than beauty. But he had seen her courage and reminded her that it did not need to be solitary. In his eyes, her worth was not measured by flawless victories, but by the fire within her that refused to yield. For the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong to doubt him so fiercely. Later that night, as they returned to the ranch, she stole a glance at him under the starlight. His expression was worn with fatigue, yet steady as always, carrying the weight of someone who bore more than his share of burdens. She realized that his words at the saloon had not been empty. They were a mirror of how he lived, with a quiet integrity that did not need defending. The frontier was cruel, but his truth was steady enough to stand against it. By the time they reached the farmhouse, she no longer saw him as just another cowboy making promises under dim lantern light. He was something else, a man who spoke little but proved much, who demanded nothing but offered everything. And though her heart still wrestled with fear, a spark of trust began to glow where suspicion once lived. As spring gave way to summer, the land turned harsher. Drought gnawed at the soil, water grew scarce, and tempers flared easily among those struggling to survive. At the ranch, the weight of hardship pressed heavier each day. Yet, through every trial, the cowboy remained unshaken, his resolve unbroken. He worked from dawn until the stars returned, never boasting, never complaining. She watched him, and with every passing day, the wall she had built around her heart weakened. One evening, after hours spent under the brutal sun, she found him sitting by the well, his head bowed, his hands raw and blistered. Without thinking, she brought a cloth and began to clean the wounds. At first, he tried to pull away, muttering that he had endured worse. But her persistence silenced him. As she tended to his hands, she realized that strength was not only in enduring pain, but in allowing someone else to share it. He had carried his burdens alone for so long, perhaps longer than she had. When he finally met her eyes, there was no mask, no pretense. "You think I saved you," he said quietly, "but the truth is, you're saving me too." His words caught her breath, for they shattered the image of him as the unshakable cowboy. Instead, she saw a man scarred not just by the land, but by loneliness. And in that moment, she understood. He had not lied. He wanted her not as a prize, but as a partner. She felt her chest tighten with a mix of fear and relief. Fear, because opening her heart meant risking everything once again. Relief, because for the first time, someone had dared to look past her surface and see the soul beneath. His earlier words, "I don't want you for your beauty, but for who you are," no longer felt like flattery. They rang now as truth, carved into every action he had taken since that night in the saloon. The West remained harsh, and tomorrow promised no safety. But as they sat together beneath the crimson glow of sunset, she realized that what bound them was not just survival. It was trust, fragile yet unyielding, forged in the fire of trials and the silence of shared burdens. And in that realization, she began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he had been telling the truth all along. The bond between them grew in the quiet spaces of everyday life. She noticed it in the way he set aside the better cut of meat for her at supper, or how he repaired the latch on her door without ever mentioning it. He noticed it in the way she rose early to tend the chickens, humming softly as the sun painted the horizon gold. Neither spoke openly of these things, yet each act became another thread tying their lives together. In the Old West, love was rarely spoken in words. It was carved in deeds, in the way two souls chose to endure side by side. But with closeness came vulnerability. One evening, as they sat on the porch, she confessed quietly, "Every man I trusted before left me with nothing." Her voice cracked, as though the memory itself burned her tongue. The cowboy turned to her, his expression steady but his eyes heavy with sorrow. "Then let me be the man who proves different," he replied. He did not swear eternal vows, nor promise a life free of pain. He offered only himself, unpolished and flawed, yet steadfast. That was more valuable to her than all the honeyed words she had ever heard. Still, she struggled with doubt. Could she truly believe him? Could she allow her heart to rest in the hands of someone who might one day vanish like the others? The West had no mercy. Men were lost to storms, to gunfire, to hunger. She had survived by expecting nothing, by trusting no one. Yet every day spent with him chipped away at that armor, leaving her both terrified and hopeful. One night, as thunder rolled across the plains, she lay awake, staring at the beams of the farmhouse ceiling. She realized that her greatest fear was not losing him. It was never allowing herself to believe in him at all. For what would her life be if she never risked trust, never dared to hope that someone truly saw her for who she was? That thought struck deeper than the threat of any raider's bullet. By dawn, as the storm cleared, she felt a shift within her. The cowboy had not demanded her trust. He had earned it, piece by piece, without rushing her, without forcing her hand. And though the fear still lingered, she knew she could no longer call him a liar. His actions had spoken louder than her doubts. The question now was whether she had the courage to let her heart finally answer. Trouble, however, was never far in the West. One afternoon, smoke rose in the distance, and by dusk, riders appeared on the horizon. Raiders, drawn by desperation or greed, came with fire in their eyes and rifles in their hands. The farmer loaded his shotgun without hesitation, his movements swift and sure. She stood beside him, her pulse quickening as fear threatened to paralyze her. But when he handed her a rifle, his voice calm and steady, she knew this was the moment that would define everything. "You said I don't know who you are," he told her as he placed the weapon in her hands. "Then show me now." His words were not a challenge meant to wound, but an invitation. He was not asking her to fight for him, but to fight with him, to stand as his equal against the darkness that had come to their door. The weight of the rifle felt heavy, but heavier still was the meaning behind his trust. The raiders thundered closer, their shouts tearing through the air. She lifted the weapon, her hands trembling, her breath unsteady. For a heartbeat, the old fears screamed in her mind, that she was weak, that she was nothing more than a face, that her beauty was all anyone had ever wanted. But then she remembered his words, his patience, his steady presence. He had seen her worth when no one else had. That memory lit a fire within her stronger than her fear. The first shot cracked, and the sound echoed across the prairie. She felt the recoil burn her shoulder, but she did not falter. The raiders scattered, surprised by the resistance. Beside her, the cowboy fought with the calm fury of a man defending not just land, but something far more precious. Together, they stood their ground, their courage unshaken despite the chaos. When the dust cleared, the raiders retreated, leaving silence in their wake. She lowered the rifle, her arms trembling, but her spirit unbroken. The cowboy looked at her, his face marked with exhaustion, but his eyes filled with something deeper: pride, respect, and the quiet confirmation of every word he had once spoken. In that moment, she no longer doubted. He had never wanted her beauty. He had wanted her strength, her courage, her soul. And now, she believed it. The farmhouse bore the scars of the raid, yet it still stood, just as they did. In the days that followed, she moved through its rooms with a new steadiness, no longer as someone uncertain of her place, but as a woman who had fought for it. The memory of that night replayed in her mind. The smoke, the thunder of hooves, the weight of the rifle in her hands. And though fear had been present, it had not defeated her. She had stood, and standing meant everything. The cowboy repaired the fences with quiet determination, his hands raw and blistered, but his spirit lighter than before. When he glanced at her, there was no trace of the man who once needed to convince her with words. Instead, his silence now carried respect. She had called him a liar once, but he had proven his truth in blood and fire, and she had proven hers as well. They were no longer two broken lives drifting in solitude. They were bound, tested, and found unbreakable. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains with streaks of crimson, she approached him with the same question that had lingered in her heart since the saloon. "Why me?" He paused, setting aside his tools, and looked at her with a gaze that seemed to cut through the years of pain she carried. "Because I see the fight in you," he said simply. "Because you are more than what the world tried to reduce you to. And because I'd rather walk this hard road with you than with anyone else." Her throat tightened at his words, not because they were grand, but because they were plain. Truth in the West was never dressed in flowers. It was as raw as the land itself. She realized then that he had never spoken to win her trust with sweet promises. He had spoken to give her a choice, to believe in something real, or to let fear keep her bound to the shadows of her past. And for the first time, she did not feel the need to question him. His actions had already spoken. The scars on his hands, the steadiness of his gaze, the way he had stood beside her when death pressed at their door, all of it was proof. The beauty she had once been cursed to carry meant nothing here. What mattered was the woman she truly was, and he had seen her from the very beginning. The seasons turned, and the land remained as merciless as ever. Droughts cracked the soil, storms tore across the horizon, and the whispers of raiders never fully faded. But through it all, the bond between them grew stronger, forged in hardship and tempered in silence. She learned to ride with confidence, to mend what was broken, to steady her aim without hesitation. And he, though hardened by years of toil, learned to share his burdens, to allow someone else into the spaces of his life once sealed shut. Neighbors began to notice the change. Where once the farmhouse had seemed hollow, now it carried the sound of voices, the rhythm of two people who had chosen to endure together. Tales spread quietly of the woman who had stood with a rifle at her side, and of the cowboy who valued her soul above all else. In a land where stories often ended in tragedy, this became a rare whisper of defiance against despair. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she spoke softly, her voice steady. "I used to think I was nothing but a face people wanted to claim. But now, I know I'm more." The cowboy's eyes softened as he looked at her, the flames reflecting in his gaze. "I knew it the first day I saw you," he said. "I just needed you to see it too." His words were not meant to persuade. They were a reminder of what had already been proven. Her heart, once guarded by walls of mistrust, opened fully in that moment. Not because she had been convinced by declarations, but because she had been shown truth day after day, trial after trial. His love was not bound to appearances, nor to fleeting desires. It was bound to the core of who she was, her courage, her resilience, her refusal to be broken by the cruelty of the West. The night outside was vast and silent. The stars stretched endlessly across the sky. Yet within the farmhouse, there was a warmth greater than the fire. She no longer doubted his words. She no longer called him a liar. Instead, she finally allowed herself to believe, and in believing, she discovered the strength that had always been hers, a strength that no beauty, no judgment, no cruelty of the West could ever take away. The days that followed carried a rhythm unlike any she had ever known. Work was still backbreaking, nights were still long, and the land still offered little mercy. Yet, she no longer felt the gnawing emptiness of being unseen. Every glance, every silence shared with him reminded her that she had finally been recognized for who she truly was. The walls of the farmhouse, once heavy with solitude, now held the sound of footsteps, the echo of laughter, and the quiet strength of two lives entwined. She often caught herself remembering the night in the saloon, the bitterness in her voice when she had called him a liar. Shame lingered in that memory, but so did awe, because he had not turned away. He had stayed, patiently proving through every action that his words were more than sentiment. The West had broken many promises, but his had endured, not because he spoke them often, but because he lived them daily. One morning, she rose early to find him already outside, tending to the animals with the same calm steadiness that had drawn her in from the start. Watching him, she realized that love in the West did not roar like thunder. It endured quietly, like roots growing deep beneath parched soil. What bound them together was not passion born of fleeting beauty, but resilience, the kind that survived storms and silence alike. Her fear of being valued only for her appearance began to fade into something distant, almost unrecognizable. He had taught her, without ever forcing the lesson, that she was more, and had always been more. His gaze had never wavered, his trust had never faltered. She was not an ornament in his story. She was the co-author of it, shaping the days as much as he did. In the Old West, many stories ended in heartbreak or tragedy. But as she stood beside him, rifle in hand and hope in her heart, she understood that their story was different. It was not about wealth or conquest. It was about endurance, truth, and the rare kind of love that saw beyond the surface and chose to stay when the world tried to tear it apart. As seasons shifted once more, their story began to ripple beyond their own lives. Travelers spoke of them, of the woman who had once been doubted and the cowboy who proved his words through fire and storm. Their tale carried across saloons and campfires, not as a fable of beauty, but as a testament to the power of truth. In a land where deceit often thrived, theirs was a story that reminded others that honesty could still survive in the dust. She sometimes returned to the saloon in her mind, reliving that first moment, the sting of her own disbelief. But instead of regret, she felt gratitude, because calling him a liar had forced him to show her not through promises, but through action, what she had been too wounded to believe. The irony was not lost on her. Her doubt had opened the door to the deepest certainty she had ever known. For the cowboy, nothing had changed in how he lived. He still rose before dawn, still worked until his hands were raw, still carried the weight of survival with unshakable resolve. But everything had changed in what he lived for. Where once he labored only for himself, now every effort was shared, every burden lightened by the knowledge that she walked the same road. She had become not his shadow, but his equal. The West remained as unforgiving as ever. Droughts still burned the land, storms still split the skies, and danger still lingered at the edge of every horizon. Yet, within their walls, there was something the West could not steal, a bond unshaken by cruelty, a truth that endured despite fear. Their story was not free of hardship, but hardship was what made it unbreakable. And so, the tale of the cowboy and the woman he refused to reduce to beauty alone became a legacy of its own. In the vast silence of the frontier, their voices lingered, their choices echoed, and their love, stripped of illusions, tested by fire, proved stronger than the land itself. For in the end, the West could take almost everything, but it could not erase a truth so deeply lived, that being seen for who you truly are is the greatest victory of all. In the end, the story of the cowboy and the woman who once called him a liar is not simply about two lives bound by chance, but about the power of truth tested against the cruelty of the West. His words, spoken under the dim light of a saloon, might have sounded fragile at first. I don't want you for your beauty, but for who you are. Yet through fire, blood, and storms, he proved that those words carried the weight of something unbreakable. She, in turn, discovered that trust is not born in promises, but in the courage to believe again after being broken. Their journey reminds us that what endures is never what lies on the surface. Beauty fades, wealth vanishes, and even the strongest hands eventually tremble. What remains is the soul, the will to fight, the resilience to endure, and the truth of who we are when everything else is stripped away. The cowboy saw that truth in her, and by believing it, he gave her the strength to see it herself. It is a lesson that reaches far beyond the frontier. We all carry scars, doubts, and fears that make us question whether we are valued for what we truly are. Yet, just as she learned, the greatest power lies in finding, or becoming, the one who sees beyond appearances. The Old West was unforgiving, but it revealed a truth we still need today, that the rarest kind of love and loyalty comes not from what the world demands of us, but from the courage to embrace who we really are. Perhaps the greatest reflection their story leaves us is this: we are all faced with moments where we must choose between disbelief and faith. She could have walked away that night, convinced he was lying like all the rest. But by staying, by daring to see beyond her fear, she discovered a truth that transformed her life. How many of us turn from such moments, never knowing what strength, what love, what belonging waits on the other side? If this story touched you, let it echo beyond the screen. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice has value here, just as hers did that night. Support this journey by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, so together we can keep alive the timeless lessons of the Old West. That courage is born in trust, that resilience is forged in hardship, and that the deepest victories are found not in appearances, but in the truth of who we are.